We're looking at the lake, Lake Managua, or known by its original name of Solentiname. And what we're seeing right in front of us there, probably the most imposing building, is that tall building, which was the Bank of America building here in Managua, but banking, and of course including the Bank of America, was nationalized by the Sandinista Revolutionary government after it took over, after overthrowing Somoza in 1979. That building, along with other banks, were nationalized, and now it serves as an office building for the National Assembly, that is the Congress of Nicaragua. Behind that, to our right, as we're looking at it, is the old cathedral, which, as Phil will tell us very soon, was very badly destroyed, or at least made unusable by the earthquake in December of 1972, devastating earthquake, but the old cathedral is still standing there, and a new one has been built fairly close to the UCA, the Central American University. Also, we can see between those two structures, the bank and the old cathedral in the background, between those, as we're viewing here, is what used to be the Palacio Nacional, the National Palace, which was the headquarters of the National Congress during Somoza's time, up until the overthrow of Somoza. And a very interesting event took place there when the Sandinistas took it over and held people hostage, held members of Congress hostage for about 3 days. This was in 1978, just 1 year before the triumph of the insurrection. They held people hostage and made their demands, which were to get a number of their political prisoners released, and also to get money to support the revolutionary campaign, and to get their political statements published in the newspaper. So those demands were granted, and they were given safe passage to Cuba. That event was very significant in 1978 because it showed people here, as well as around the world, that they could win. They could actually succeed in overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship with its National Guard. At this point, I would ask Phil to come on into the picture. And Phil wants to tell us about that cathedral and a very important protest that was taking place there in 1972.
One of the interesting parts of this is that a priest, a Catholic priest, Uriel Molina, was so upset with the abuses of going on under the dictatorship that he, with university students, occupied that cathedral.
And of course, Father Uriel Molina and the people with him, along with Father Fernando Cardenal, and as you mentioned, a number of students, were very strongly motivated by their social commitment as Christians, and they felt that they needed to work for liberation, and the struggle that presented itself was very close at hand here. If they're starting to talk about liberation theology and the liberation of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and so forth, and Jesus' own message of the gospel being good news to the poor, freedom to captives, they had their work cut out for them right here in Nicaragua. So have you heard people talking about that kind of Christian commitment here, and that was at least a large part of their motivation?
Well, I think not only that, because that's obvious in one of the clearest cases, but there were many cases throughout Latin America where, for the first time in history, the church people, I'm not necessarily talking about the hierarchy, but Christians and others joined in the revolution all over Latin America. This happened in many, many countries in Latin America. And while it's happened on an individual basis in other places, in this case in Latin America, it happened all over the continent. So I think that it's another symbol of the fact that Christianity doesn't have to be the reactionary or fundamentalist kind of modality that many people in the United States think about when they think about the church. This was a religious revolution that joined in with a much broader revolution, including all kinds of people from here in Nicaragua and other places throughout the continent.
Phil, what would you say that would be your own source of inspiration? Any particular aspects of Scripture, aspects of the Gospel that support this kind of liberation perspective in your own personal life that has played an important part in your motivation?
Yes, the answer is very simple because it's the most important part of the Old and New Testament, which is basically brushed aside except for quotes about the prophets, because the scriptures are very clear that the prophetic word is a key aspect of not just love and justice and forgiveness and so forth, but also the prophetic word against those who have power and challenging them, not raising up in arms against those officials, but exposing them, unmasking them for whom they are. And so I think it's very important that we understand that the Bible was very clear, including Jesus, who was crucified precisely because he spoke the prophetic word to the Pharisees, to the priests in the temple, and finally to the representative, of course, of the Roman Empire. And so we have this example in Latin America that says, stand up and apply your biblical understanding to these circumstances wherever they may be throughout the world.
And it seems that among the Catholic population, the Second Vatican Council and other movements that preceded that really opened the Bible to the Catholic population, and perhaps that helped people to see the political and social ramifications of their faith.
Absolutely, and it happened in many places such as Solentiname, the islands that are in Lake Nicaragua, right down at the coast, not very far from Costa Rica. And those islands became a place where that practice was put into function early on, even before the revolution took hold, and campesinos who had very little educational background and very, very little nature of the Bible began to read the Bible.
Well, Phil, now we know the United States is not invading countries of Latin America. We're invading and using military force in other parts of the world, but in Latin America, we're not invading these countries. But how is the U.S. still present militarily in helping the repressive forces against these movements for social change?
Yes, these issues have a direct relationship to the United States policy, which at that time was to force third world countries to open their doors to the North American corporations. And many of them wanted to go their own economic way and set up a economic order that would help and benefit the poor and not simply the ruling elite.
Well, we were talking earlier about U.S. involvement in this country, Nicaragua, as well as in the Dominican Republic. That is through outright military occupation of these countries early in the 20th century. And then we had other forms of involvement, intervention by the United States through the CIA coup in Guatemala, for instance, and the U.S. support from the Reagan administration for the counter-revolutionary forces against the Sandinista Revolutionary government in Nicaragua in the 80s. How is the United States still involved in some ways in supporting these repressive forces? Because here in Nicaragua, the U.S. left the country in 1933 after the military occupation, but they had created the National Guard with Somoza in charge. And then, of course, he became the first dictator in the Somoza dynasty. Now, is the U.S. still involved heavily in supporting these repressive military and police forces?
Yes, Joe, and I'll give you an example, and I'm glad that you brought up the issue of Guatemala as one example. That country was put into military control by the Dulles brothers back in 1954, and from that time on, that country has not been ruled by democratic rule, even though they have a so-called democracy and elections there, but rather by the police and military.
Now, Phil, up until now, I think many people in the United States may have been able to see these issues as being very distant, very remote from them. That is, we're talking about the suffering of people in Latin America, people living on $2 a day or less, all kinds of damage to the environment in Latin America, deforestation and so forth. But now, do you feel that in the United States, people are beginning to feel that some of these problems are common problems, that people are feeling themselves more desperate situations all the time, economically and in other ways too? Is there a certain third world effect that's being felt more and more in the United States? You mentioned the growing unemployment, young people not having a very positive view of their future, their possibilities, more and more cutbacks of social programs. Is this all due to the basic principle of capitalist development, which is maximization of profits, which leaves no room for humanitarian or even ecological considerations?
And I think that we are beginning to see elements of this coming into our own country. And I think that because I'm a deeply religious person, I think that we have to understand that the one serious problem in the United States is the fundamentalism in many churches, and I'm talking about Catholic and Protestant and fundamentalist and Pentecostal and so forth, where their only concern is their religious orientation and not these larger issues, which is very clearly in the Bible essential, and the fact that one of the most important features of the Bible in both the Old and New Testament is the prophetic word. And the prophetic word is not spoken in many, many churches and synagogues in the United States because that prophetic word would challenge a number of the issues that we've been talking about today. These things that we experienced, Joe, and to your audience 20, 30, 40 years ago are still very much alive in Latin America. And people are struggling for their rights despite the fact that very little of this appears in the news. We have to understand that these struggles are going on just like they are in the United States, with people protesting against the situation that there are no jobs available for large numbers of Americans. So this is not, the past is a help for us to understand the historical context in which many of these protests during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s took place, but that doesn't mean that they don't continue.